into all the conversations. There are no light between it and the policy. Hit all the mosquitoes as they fly out of the swamp, right? Ray, what is ISIS? ISIS is a creature of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. When the Sunni were marginalized in favor of the Shia, and when the Iraqi army was disbanded, there were no place to go, and it took several years, but finally they got themselves organized, and that's what you're seeing now. The people who were opposed to the U.S. invasion, and particularly opposed to the Shia oppression of Sunnis in Iraq. I have no idea where he is. It really doesn't matter that much to me. We have killed 6 or 7 second-in-commands of ISIS, but it never seems to make any difference. There are always people that will come behind.
Charlie Hebdo, Brussels, and Ankara attacks. What's your opinion? And what is next?
Well, what we have here is what the smart people in Washington call a disbalanced and unbalanced warfare. What we have are people who don't have jet fighters, who don't have artillery or heavy weaponry, but need to get back at what they see as U.S. support for very oppressive regimes, and also U.S. support for the policies of Israel without any question. Now, I will give you an analogy. After Dr. Martin Luther King was killed right here in America, right here in Washington, there were riots on 14th Street. And a very good friend of mine went down and she tried to restrain the people, and she found this 12-year-old boy with a big rock in his hand. She grabbed his hand and she said, "Son, don't do that." And he looked up and he said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, think of your future." I said, "Ma'am, I ain't got no future." Boom. My point, if you ain't got no future, that's what you do. When people have no hope, when people see their family being killed by drones, when people see invasions from the West, that deprives people of hope, and there's a natural tendency to seek revenge. And that is how I see what's happened in Paris and in Istanbul and in Brussels. Attributable to CIA, you say? Is that your question? I don't see any evidence of that. The causality, yeah, well, you see, what I would say is that you don't need any CIA aiding and abetting these attacks. They are aided and abetted by U.S. policy that has no air or no light between it and the policies of Israel, the Palestinian problem, and the policies with respect to shoring up the Saudis, just because they have lots of money, or shoring up the Qataris for the same, or showing up supporting Israel no matter what it does. And U.S. politicians brag about the fact that we support Israel 100%. Well, if Israel kills 1,400 civilian Palestinians, that has an effect on people there, and I think that you don't need the CIA to aid and abet that effect. Do you mean the Kurdish?
Kurds.
Yeah. Well, the Kurds in the history of United States foreign policy have always been the pawns of history. As you know, they occupy large stretches of not only Turkey, but Syria and Iraq. and they have always been expendable. Now, more recently, since the invasion of Iraq, the Kurds have played a constructive role from USA interests in taking control over the northern parts of Iraq. Now, I don't know how long that will stay, or how long the clash of objectives between President Erdogan and President Obama with respect to the Kurds will persist. But it's a very messy, a very complicated situation, and my sorrow has to do with the people on the end of all this, and that is the poor Kurdish people who seem as far away from getting their homeland as they have ever been. The White House has many people and so many targets. Now, there are those people who are very close to Israel and for whom Israel's policy is ipso facto United States policy. Now, I don't criticize those people for what they believe. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, okay? But I do not think those people should be running U.S. foreign policy. Then there are the people who are interested in oil and in permanent military bases and having a military presence in that part of the world. Those two play a huge role, but the biggest role, the largest and most significant role, has to do what we call the military-industrial congressional complex. Those are the people that make the arms, that sell the arms, that make cash for oil and so forth, and then they take part of that and they put it in the pockets of our representatives and senators. They in turn get elected, and then they vote for more weaponry. More weapons are created, more weapons are sold, more Saudis get very rich, and then we put one. So it's a kind of a circular thing which is very, very corrupt, and which renders our Congress beholden to these very moneyed interests. Well, I believe that Brussels was the target because it was easy. Some answers are easy. It had very loose security arrangements, very free travel back and forth, and a security and intelligence apparatus that is very good about listening into all the conversations, but not very good about following up on them. So it's a very sad situation. But I think they picked Brussels because the travel back and forth was easy, and that they could make a big splash because Brussels, of course, is an international city unlike any other in Europe. Well, I think it speaks to the speed with which they can catch people, but the slowness with which they can prevent people from causing terrorist acts. Now, all these monitoring systems are like fingerprints, okay? Now, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, invented fingerprints, and if you rob a bank and you put your fingerprints on the window, they're going to catch you, right? But did fingerprints ever prevent a bank robbery? Never. Okay? So it is with all this information. If they get an ID card or they get the equivalent of fingerprints, they can trace back into their data bank and sift all through the millions of bits in that thing and, oh, that was he. But they can't prevent a terrorist attack. And that speaks to the problem of amassing more and more hay for this haystack and making it more and more difficult to find the needle under the haystack so that they can prevent these attacks rather than just find out who did it later. Well, you know, after 9/11, we had these color codes, red for high danger, yellow for be cautious, orange, and so forth. And it seemed to me that part of the reason for these codes was to keep people on edge, keep them frightened. The message was, be afraid, be very afraid. Some of these alerts coincided with some real happenings where the government did want people to be very afraid. The passing of legislation, very restrictive, very impinging on civil liberties, okay? So, whether ISIS would have the capability of attacking in the United States is a big question. You can always have one lone person. Whether there would be a conspiracy, I think our security organs are probably good enough to prevent that. But Europe is an easy target. It's a soft target. And the French decided, well, if Washington says, go ahead and cooperate in the war in Syria, and they said, well, we always salute, so let's salute again, and they thought that they could escape this kind of retaliation. They were sadly mistaken, because they are far easier targets than they are in the United States. You know, basically, what we have here is a situation where you don't prevent terrorism by collecting information and then finding the terrorists and bringing them to justice. Defeating terrorism is like defeating malaria. Now, with malaria, you find where the mosquitoes are, and you trace them back to the swamp where they breed. And then you set up 3 platoons of sharpshooters, and you try to hit all the mosquitoes as they fly out of the swamp, right? Wrong. What do? You drain the swamp. What am I saying? I'm saying these terrorists have a swamp of legitimate grievances. They hate U.S. policy. They don't hate America, our freedoms, or our democracy. They hate what they see us doing, drone strikes, complete support of Israel, and so forth. So once you take those grievances, that swamp of grievances, and drain that swamp, then and only then can you prevent more terrorists from breeding in that swamp. Well, you know, one is really required to explain why Obama acts as though he's afraid. I still give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that he means to do good things. I think that he would like to bring the torturers, for example, to justice. But he looks around and he sees the torturers right out there in the CIA, and he decides, whoa, what might happen to me? And so he leaves them in place, the same people who conducted these activities. Now, how do you explain that? Well, I think one explanation is that he's afraid of them. He knows what happened to President Kennedy, okay? There are books written on that. So that's the one I favor. The other explanation, many of my friends say, oh, McGovern, come on, you know. He's in with the worst of them. He likes torture. He just professes to dislike it. He likes the wars. He doesn't stop any of the wars. He doesn't close Guantanamo. How long are you going to believe this guy? And that's an equally tenable explanation. I don't know which one is right. It's diffuse, meaning it's sort of shared. If you have a weak president like Barack Obama, who doesn't know much about Washington, doesn't know much about the military or the intelligence services, then he is weaker than they are. Now, if you look at Afghanistan, for example, he came in and he had bragged during his campaign before he became president that Afghanistan was the good war, okay? That was the good war. Iraq, a fool's errand, just a chaos, okay? Now, I thought that he said that just to be elected. You know, I have to say something good about our wars, okay? So, Afghanistan's a good war, right? But then, he brought in all these advisors, Bobby Gates, Hillary Clinton, other people who were responsible for rooting for Iraq and for all these other. He thought that he could control them, and they controlled him. By leaks to the press and by other artful things that go on in Washington, they forced his hand, and before you knew it, 2 months into his reign, he was doubling down in Afghanistan. 4 months later, doubling down again, and look at it now. Look at it now. And so I do not believe that he's fully in control of his foreign policy. Even when he says something about ISIS, very often a general or the Secretary of Defense will say something different. It doesn't seem to matter to Mr. Obama. So I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't see how he can live with this, but he's been living with it for 7 years. We ought to recognize it for what it is. Well, Donald Trump is not all Americans.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. There is a purpose here to frighten Americans and to blame the current administration for not being anti-terrorist enough. So when you hear Donald Trump or the other candidates say these things, they are appealing to the basest instincts of humanity, which are revenge, which are unthinking retaliation. That's what we've seen. That's what we've seen since 13 years ago, when it was deemed necessary or advisable to take advantage of 9/11 and strike out against Iraq. Most Americans were deceived into thinking that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, and we wanted to get him, okay? That's the worst of America, the worst of any peoples, and that's what these people are appealing to. I think they're going to lose. I think they're going to lose badly, because I have more faith in my fellow citizens than they do. Well, as long as we control many of the finances of the world, we are sitting pretty, as the expression goes. Now, Wall Street has always been a financial center, and the problem is that this is eroding. Well, the Wall Street people have great control. Hillary Clinton has made speeches there and gotten $250,000 for them. So Wall Street controls the money. The military is very much, the military-industrial complex very much joined in that. And so we have an uneven system where the financial interests have more political power than they should, and when a financial collapse happens, who gets bailed out? The people who lose their homes? No. Wall Street gets bailed out. And so this, over time, is an unhealthy situation. It will have to change. And what we see now is that even the United States is not able to call the shots financially as it used to be able to do. Witness the fact of the Silk Road, China and Iran and Russia and the others in the Eurasian continent getting together, and maybe even buying oil for something other than dollars.